We just want better engagement. Okay, what does that mean?
Welcome to the first episode of our Digital Customer Communications podcast, where we discover how leading companies engage, retain, and delight customers at scale. In this episode, we speak to Chloe Taylor, CEO of Quietroom, a consultancy dedicated to enhancing communication strategies for financial services companies. Chloe, welcome.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining me. Today, we're talking about ROI in digital customer communications. You work with a lot of financial services companies, a lot of enterprise companies on their communications. Can you set the scene for us on the challenges that they face when it comes to the ROI of those communications and getting a clear view of it?
Yeah, definitely. So the first thing to say, I suppose, is quite often communication, and it's almost never something in and of itself. Communication is only there because you've got something you need to say, whether that's about a product, about a service, about a change. So it's never in isolation, which sometimes means that when you try and get an ROI about pure communication, it's very difficult because the only reason it's there is to drive a new behavior, change somebody's approach to something, to either leave them better off or to improve the business. And so sometimes trying to make ROI just about communication is the wrong place to start. And starting a little bit earlier in that journey is really helpful. So, why are you communicating? Sometimes the problem is the answer to why you're communicating is because the regulator says we have to. And obviously measuring an ROI on something you're only doing because you're motivated by regulation can be tricky. So trying to get behind the regulation, trying to understand what it is you're really hoping to get out of this is often the way to measure it. And then there's all the problems that come around actually how you measure it. So once you know what you're trying to change, how do you make sure you've got the right metrics set up, the right systems in place to capture that data that you need to look back on?
So in terms of starting that journey, how do companies start on the road to solutions? So what they're doing now might not be returning the value that they need. It might not comply with new regulation. There may be some customer pains that are being voiced. How do they get from that point to, right, this is the solution and this is what we should be doing?
So typically it's about taking a little bit of time at the beginning. And I'm sure this is nothing new for anybody, but taking that time to do the work up front, to do that discovery phase, to really dig into why we're doing what we're doing and what we're hoping will change, and digging a little bit deeper into what you are looking for as an end outcome, because often that end outcome is the thing that's hard to measure with communication. When people talk about, we just want better engagement. Okay, what does that mean? Do we mean engagement that is about just people looking at a website or a portal that we've built, opening an email that we've sent? Is that engagement to us? Or when we say engagement, are we really talking about building people's confidence and capability and encouraging people to actually interact with something that we're sending or that we're talking about? So doing that extra layer of digging, the sort of 5 whys, how much can you get into the nitty gritty of it is often really valuable, and sometimes gets you 80% of the way there in terms of being able to come up with something measurable. And the other thing is a simple step in principle, but it's just mapping everything out. As I said, communication is so often thought of as just that letter, email, website, that piece at the very end of a journey. And actually, so often, some of the opportunities for solving a problem, for changing behavior, for landing something new with your consumers or your end users is in the process as much as it is in the piece of comms that goes out and that lands on a doorstep or in an inbox. So those two things together, knowing exactly what you're looking to change and knowing the process that your communications sit within, will often allow you to identify not only where you can be measuring change, so where in the sort of flow of interaction, of information, can you have those measures in place? It might not all be at the end. And once you've identified those, sometimes there are quicker fixes to be had in that process and the journey that might actually be a smaller change that has a bigger impact than revamping the very end product that's the thing that you send to your consumers right at the end.
Yeah, it's so important to consider communications in context. And I think we've seen it, and you see it as consumers. Large companies make an improvement in one side of the business. So, you experience it with things like HMRC. Some of that website is really good, maybe around tax. But then when it comes to childcare, the same innovations haven't been applied. The same streamlining of communications haven't been applied. It's obviously very difficult in an enterprise organization to not have that siloing. How do you get over those barriers? And what other pitfalls do you see enterprise businesses falling into when it comes to communications?
I think ideally in those kind of big corporations where you're very likely to get silos, you've got different teams, different customer bases, different product services that are split out, trying to have a function. I mean, if you're talking company functions, try and build some kind of cross-functional communication department, individual, a series of champions, trying to make sure that people are crossing those boundaries when they're producing communication. Most companies are very good at doing it for brand. I have so many clients that come to us and say, and the brand police will have to have a look at it. But actually, the brand police are doing it right. They've got a consistent, centralized way of looking at something. They don't have to build everything, but there's a level of consistency assurance. And when you're investing in one part of the business to make your communication really, really strong, deliver the results you need, then actually there's a huge value in having some people who sit at the heart of things and have that central cross-functional role who are then able to port over the best practice. The other thing, which is probably what makes the biggest difference, is actually testing, building testing into your processes. And we have seen amazing results and so fascinating. Every single time we put something into testing, we're surprised. Someone says something that isn't out there, isn't unreasonable, but just that we haven't thought of before. Or that is something that people think is best practice, but in different contexts, we have to flex these ideas. A great example, for a long time, people talk about shorter is better. People don't want to read a lot of content. Make it shorter, make it shorter. In loads of cases, that's exactly the right way to look at things. People's attention is scarce. People don't have loads of time. But sometimes you get exactly the opposite message when you put something through testing. We did a piece of work. We were looking at communicating a big change to a kind of pension scheme for members. And we tried to make it as short as possible. That's sort of what you hear of best practice. And we've seen that work really well in the past. But with this thing that was very complicated, that was a big change that was going to cause potential for people to feel worried about, change must be a bad thing. In financial services, change never feels like a good thing to a consumer. And they said, I'd just like some more context. I'd like some more context up front to put things into perspective, to help me understand all of the robust thinking that it seems like you've gone through, but that I haven't understood, and therefore I'm feeling a bit nervous about. So in that case, your communication gets longer, but that's what people want. And it would have been very hard for us and our client, who are also experts in the room, to say, I think people are going to want to hear more. So putting it into testing allows you to really be confident that when you launch something, you're going to have the best opportunity of it landing well first time. It also makes a huge difference for stakeholder management and that stakeholder input. They're coming back to that idea of these big siloed organizations. Sometimes the challenge, as well as making sure best practice sort of flows across the business, is that when you've got those large org charts and you have to go through 8 rounds of stakeholder input and feedback with people who aren't in your day-to-day, who maybe aren't as close to the ground as you are, but have big sort of business responsibilities, being able to put testing results in front of somebody and say, not only this is why we've done what we're doing from a business perspective, but here's how confident we can be that it's going to land the way we intend it to land because we've put it in front of people. So not only does it actually make things better in terms of their outcome, but we see it really streamline the process of getting to end communications, which I'm sure most people would say is pretty valuable when you've got 101 things to be doing.
Yeah, it's great when you've got a solution that solves problems for a lot of people within your business, but that's a double-edged sword. And if you're solving people's problems, they're invested in it and they care about it, which is great. But you then have to adjust your messaging and the way that you communicate that change project to a lot of different people with different interests and different angles on that problem. Can you talk a little bit more to the testing and how that actually plays out practically?
Yeah, so I mean, there's so many ways of getting insight before you start something or as a part of the process of building out a communication project or a new journey. I mean, even a new product. We do work with clients sometimes who say, I want to launch a new product. And one of the challenges I'm getting is this product too complex to get to market? So can we actually do some what feels like communications and consumer testing of marketing messages now before we've even gone to market? Because actually part of the pushback is sometimes how it's going to be received from a sort of consumer reception. So these things come all the way across the sort of product and service life cycle, I suppose. When it comes to testing, it's different to research. So that's one important thing, I guess, to start with. Research is typically about understanding people's needs, wants, opinions, ways of interacting with things. It's really valuable because it can shape where you begin. You can research without having written anything yet, without having produced anything yet. You're just trying to understand what people want and what people will respond to. But the one big limitation of research, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, is that people are a little bit inconsistent and don't always follow up with what they said they wanted, what they said they were going to do. It doesn't always quite reflect what they would actually do or what they would actually respond to. So testing has this really important role where you're putting something real in front of people, in front of a target audience, and saying, react to this. There's loads of ways it can play out. You can do quite a straightforward one where effectively you're just asking questions of people, whether that's about how clear it was for them, how they feel about it, sentiment testing. How did this make you feel? Do you trust the organization that sent this to you? What would you do off the back of this? And another one that I think is particularly interesting from our standpoint in the financial services world, particularly with some of the regulation consumer duty that's come into play in the last few years, is not just asking, do you understand this, but asking people to play it back. Tell me what you've just read. Answer a couple of comprehension questions, because so often what's sort of, I mean, maybe it's not surprising, is that people's response to how well have you understood this doesn't always correlate with the marks effectively that you would give someone for a comprehension test afterwards. We're not trying to catch people out, but one of the challenges is that people don't always know what they don't know. And so testing allows you to put a real thing in front of real people and see where you're missing the mark. It also doesn't have to be a huge exercise. There's lots of different statistical models out there that will talk to you about how many test participants you need. But testing doesn't have to be an empirical study. It doesn't have to prove one way or the other whether the approach you've taken is right, but it will give you a much better sense of whether it will land than you and your other stakeholders having a look at it. So sometimes it could be as small as finding 5 people to look at something, to answer some questions, to give you their response. Now, if all 5 say something different, then actually maybe your challenge is you've got a more diverse audience than you thought and you need to be segmenting better. But often we see the same responses coming up time and time again, even with a sample size of just sort of 5 or 6 people. And there are some amazing platforms out there now. It's so much cheaper, so much quicker than it ever used to be. We can be putting communication into testing on a Friday afternoon and logging back on a Monday morning and having a load of test results to start our week with and refine things and improve them for the next round. So it's really exciting for us. And a lot of the industry, I think, has become more and more up for it in a way that perhaps in the past we used to get a bit more pushback.
I imagine that's really important, not just in terms of messaging, but also for channels. People come to you probably with a presupposition of the solution in terms of channel, probably not as much in terms of messaging, because that's seen as much more subjective and there are more grey areas. But I imagine there's lots of problems that people go, right, okay, this deserves an SMS solution, this deserves an email solution. And you have to stop them and go, actually, no, we need to start from a little further back and establish if that is the right direction. Would that be right to say?
Yeah, definitely. And sometimes, there's lots of different things at play there. But one of them is around how are people going to digest this information? There's brilliant tools out there to look at how people navigate websites. People don't read websites in the order that the designer of the website necessarily built them. People flit around, people scroll down, people skim read, people jump about between headings. And that's often a really interesting way of saying, okay, how are people looking at this information? And when you're having a very specific message to deliver, again, that idea of, well, how much information do people really need to know? What do we want them to have access to, even if we're not putting it in front of them? You know, back in the day, and maybe not as long ago back as we'd hope, but the idea of sort of sending a letter and then having a pack of paper at the back that is FAQs, commonly asked questions, here's chapter and verse on the letter we sent you, just in case, was sort of the solution. People said, oh, well, some people might want everything that has ever been written on the topic, so we better send it all, even though 99% of people are only going to read the letter. And the other 1% are split between people who genuinely will read all the bump because they're interested, and people who feel like they have to because it's there and they might have missed something. So where we've got to in a more digital communication landscape is that there are so many opportunities to do that layering, to say, okay, well, how complex is the first message we're getting across to people? And why might somebody want more? And how can we build that journey so that when something lands in their inbox, lands in their in their hands, in whatever format that is, what questions do we think are going to come up? Are there actions we need them to take? What's the best way to hand them off from one piece of communication to the next part of the journey? And sometimes you have to fall back on what's available. You know, sometimes somebody says, actually, I've only got email addresses. Well, we'll send an email then. But we can still think about the way that that piece of communication interacts with the next step, or the step that's come before. But how they all interact is often half the battle.
You mentioned data there. Obviously, having the right data about your customers is important, and getting even more important. How much is building that kind of the data capture and the data enrichment a part of the communications journey when you work with these types of organizations? How much does technology integrations and data play into, you know, what you would have traditionally as a consultancy just been focused on communications, on the messaging, but now all these other things are much more integrated with that problem?
So I think there's two key areas where we get involved, and it's not a linear journey with data. It's very much a circular sort of situation where, depending on where you are in your cycle, you're going round and round. Where we get most involved is either in the data capture piece. So if you're trying to encourage people to give you their personal data, there's huge variety across the population in terms of what people are comfortable giving. You know, there are people who take the time to reject all cookies on every website they ever go to, and there are people that accept all everywhere because they just can't be bothered. There are people who won't give their email to sign up to something because they don't want anything in their inbox, and there's other people who just give it away willy-nilly. So there's a huge spectrum, and often one of the places that we're asked to come in is to make a campaign trying to get people's data, whether that's capturing email addresses and SMSs, to give that data in a way that they're confident they know what it's for, that they feel that it's in their best interest. Because so many of the businesses we work with are saying it'll be so much better for our consumers if we're able to communicate with them digitally. Their experience will be better, things will be more accurate, but that's not always how people feel when they're just asked for their information. So some of the way we do get involved in this is around that capture piece, helping people really understand why we're asking, what it's for, what you could expect once you've given us those pieces of information. And then there's the complete other end in many ways, which is, what can you do with the data that you have, and what might actually be valuable to have as more information from a communications perspective? Because sometimes you can have all the data in the world, but it's not the thing that's going to tell you how different people are going to respond to a piece of communication. So sometimes you could get almost blind to the number of variables you have. You know, let's cut them up into 45 segments of consumer, and then you go, actually, there's only two. For this message we're talking about, you're going to be in one of two camps, and therefore we only need two segments. So that idea of, once you've got a data set, which everybody has, how should we use it? And there's probably two ways of looking at how to use that data set. And they're sort of two ends of the same telescope. You've got one which is segmentation, where you're saying, right, here's our consumer base, or here's our target audience. How how could we segment them up? Where do we see pockets of people who look the same or who we think would be appropriate for this product or that product, or we think are at risk of making a poor choice and we should get involved and give them something to help them? And so you look at your whole and then you figure out what you're going to say to different segments. The flip side of that is when you look at, I suppose, what we'd call personalization, which is where you know what you want to say, or you know that actually you're going to do a campaign about a new feature, or you're going to do a campaign about keeping people's details up to date. And then you're saying, well, I know what the message is. Should I be splitting up my audience so that that message lands right with each person? Because actually people are going to respond to different things. And so often I think we get a little bit conflated between those two ways of personalizing. They're both valid, but they are different. And if you know what you want to say, start with that and then look at your audience. If you don't know what to say, you can use your audience to figure out what might be a priority message, but sometimes they get a bit muddled.
There's also the choice element as well, I guess. There are situations where you have or you can ask your customers how they would like to be contacted, how often they'd like to be contacted, which channels. When is that a good idea? Because obviously you can give customers too much choice as well. You don't want to ask them for every type of communication you send, where they'd like it, how often they'd like it, etc. How do you make that decision between giving customers choice and choosing for them?
That's a great question. And I think it probably varies quite a lot between organizations, but also why you're communicating. So the first question, I suppose, that I'd ask to a client having this conversation would be, well, are you not confident you're sending people relevant communications? Because if you're really confident that you know your consumer base, you understand the people in your target audience, and that you're putting the work in to make sure you're only sending them things that are relevant to them, that are about them and their circumstances, then I'd argue that rather than asking people what they want, you should be looking at your data, doing testing, doing research, getting feedback, whether that's through analytics or whether that's through things like surveys, to refine the way you're communicating with people to get closer and closer to the right balance. Sometimes I think it could be a cop-out to say, well, we'll just ask people. And actually what you often get when you ask people is either total apathy and no response, where people can't even be bothered to go in and tell you what they want to hear from you, or the extreme people who come in and just unsubscribe from everything and say, I don't want to hear from you at all, which isn't often what people are looking for. That's not often the result that businesses are looking for. So the places I've seen it done well, where businesses are asking for input, is that it's in the right moment. So we talk about the principle of sort of just-in-time communication, not asking someone to imagine a situation in the future and give you an opinion now, but in the moment to tell you how they feel about something. So, for example, if you're a business and you're sending communications about, say, lots of different opportunities or lots of different products that you have, for example, and you're sending a broad spectrum because actually you haven't got the data on your consumers to understand which of these might be right for them. Don't send them a survey to say which of these things might you one day ever be interested in. But when you send an email that might be about a specific product, you can have something in there to say, is this something that you're in the market for? Or, is this not relevant for you? But in the moment, really easy, really simple piece of feedback that you can get, which not only allows you in a very sort of process-driven way to say, right, we're going to take them off that mailing list, but gives you data on that consumer so that everything you do in the future is better. Because, I'm trying to think of a good example now, but if you're talking about something like car insurance, they say, no, I don't want to hear about car insurance. Oh, okay, fine, we'll take you off car insurance. And then you've got something else that's about, I'm not going to think of a good example now, but, road tax. Well, they didn't need car insurance. They told you maybe in the fee, but they didn't have a car. So stop focusing on that. Talk about something else. There's all sorts of ways that it can not only inform what you do and don't send, but continuously move you towards a more personalized and sort of better way of talking to people. But I am always a little bit skeptical of the sort of survey that goes out and says, which of my email newsletters would you like to hear? Because typically what that actually prompts is a huge volume of unsubscribes.
Yeah, I don't want to know about car insurance most of the year, and most people don't. And it's very difficult. Do you want to hear about our latest offers in this area? Do you want our newsletter on this topic? Well, how good will it be? Will it be relevant to me? I don't. It's difficult as well, because in those situations, you see it as a blanket opt-in. You'll be getting the same thing as thousands and thousands of other people. And you don't actually imagine as a consumer the personalization efforts that actually do go into a lot of these comms now. So you're kind of downplaying it in your mind when you're making that decision. In terms of personalization, obviously we've gone way beyond, hi, Sam, here's your latest newsletter, first name personalization, and especially in financial services and regulated industries where there is a lot of data held on the products that customers have. Can you talk a little bit to how personalization is changing the way that these companies communicate with their customers, and how that can drive engagement and ROI?
Yeah, so there's so much research that's been done on, it is mostly around understanding and engagement with people's finances. And there's lots of different nuances that come across. But one thing that is almost always one of your key findings is people want to hear about their stuff. I want to hear about my money. I want to hear about my finances, what options are available to me, particularly relevant with finances because it is so personal. And it also is for a lot of people a source of anxiety, whether that's because they don't feel confident or knowledgeable enough to engage with the subject, or whether it's because they're actually worried about their financial situation and sort of whether they have enough. Nobody ever thinks they've got enough savings. Nobody ever thinks they've got enough in their pension. That is not enough to drive engagement. People just bury their head in the sand. So personalization doesn't have to be flashy. I think that's something important to say. Personalization doesn't mean Spotify wrapped of financial products. It doesn't need to be a big sort of flashy piece because actually people just want it to feel as simple as possible. And often that means personalizing it to the extent that everything you're saying to your end consumer, is relevant to them. Now, that won't extend to absolutely everything because there'll be products they're not involved in that they might be, but they're not sure. But for most people who are engaging with sort of lay audiences, you're not working with other professionals in the world of investment or the world of pensions or the world of insurance. You're working with end users. They want you to hold their hand. And what that typically means is walking them from here's your situation now to as close to kind of the guidance piece as you can get. Again, all the research says I want to hear about my stuff and I want help. We don't talk about advice. We don't talk about guidance. Obviously, there are regulatory lines in the sand that we've got to be really mindful of. But where we see the best responses from consumers in both testing, but then also in actual, results, levels of engagement, people taking decisions and changing their behavior, is because a firm has decided that they're confident giving guidance. And that comes from, to go all the way back to the beginning of this sort of topic of personalization and data, they're confident giving guidance because they really understand the consumers that they're talking to. So they could be confident that they are, not recommending products in the way that might stray over a financial boundary, but that they're presenting solutions to problems or things that might make the most of an opportunity that they're pretty confident this consumer might be in the ballpark for. It's a huge conversation that goes on with the compliance departments and all of this kind of thing. But the businesses that are doing it really well are the ones that are really stepping into that guidance territory, and their consumers are coming away saying that was helpful. It wasn't an email that felt salesy. That wasn't an email that felt like it was just, as you say, a blast to thousands of people. That felt like a business who wants me to make the most of my money, understands who I am and where I am in the kind of financial system, and is going to hold my hand and sort of get me to the next step.
It feels uncomfortable giving guidance, I imagine, not just because of regulation, but because if you're using data for personalization, there's always that risk that the data could be wrong, could be inaccurate. How do you, that is, an area of compliance in itself. How do you walk that line? How involved do you guys get in that data accuracy?
So we wouldn't try and do the data accuracy point in terms of improving data sets. Our clients will know better than us every day of the week whether their data is up to date and how accurate it is. But what we would look at is how do we take this consumer through a journey so that we have the best chance of them flagging if it's wrong, or the best way of helping make sure somebody understands what these numbers refer to so that they might pick up if there's an error, or point them to the place where they can check these numbers, or in places where we are not sure about the data, how do we present that? Because that's also something that businesses are nervous of doing, and sometimes avoid sending any communications because they're not confident in the data sets they've got. But then you're letting those consumers down. They're the most neglected of all, and actually probably the ones that need to engage, because they won't be on top of it if they haven't even updated their details with you. So often our piece of the puzzle is saying, okay, let's run some scenarios on this journey. The easiest one is we have all the data and it's all correct, and this person knows it's all correct. Okay, great. What about a journey where the data isn't right? How do we present it in such a way that we're being very clear what we're talking about every step of the way? And that gives us, partly it does give not protection, but peace of mind, I think, for businesses to say, we're not hiding anything, we're not assuming anything, but we're also not making the consumer do all the work. That's the line that often businesses need to tread. And then again, making it really, really easy to take an onward step if someone looks at it and goes, I don't trust this, I'm not confident about this. The instinct for many people when they see something they don't think is quite right or they don't trust, particularly in the world of finance, or as I say, research continually shows that people feel out of their depth, anxious, not confident. The easiest thing to do is just to close the laptop and walk away and go, I'll do it another weekend. I don't want to spend my Sunday afternoon ringing up a helpline that I'll probably be on for 2 hours trying to check if this data is right. How do you build a journey that gives people opportunities throughout to say, I'm not sure about this? It might be as simple as saying, well, actually, if you check your payslip, you'll be able to see if this is right. If sometimes there's a really easy fix or a really easy way of checking and having that easily accessible. Other times it is, how do I point someone to a chatbot, a help desk, an inbox, somewhere that they can go, that again, we're still holding their hand through the checking process, not abandoning them if they step outside of our neatly manicured path that we've curated for them, because people don't always engage in a linear way, and we need to be ready for that and have designed everything so that it works, even if we haven't got it 100% right from the get-go.
And AI could possibly play a part in straying from that carefully manicured path that we might have created for our customers, but obviously there are risks there as well. A lot of financial services companies, if they're worried about personalization, then they'll be really worried about AI. And there are areas where it's starting to be used, other areas where it will take a lot longer because of the regulatory guidelines. Can you tell us how companies have started to explore AI for communications, and where you think it should be used now and where possibly it's not there yet?
Yeah, so the places that are really exciting and are really already in practice are the businesses that are using it as that kind of assistant, that AI assistant where, if 10 years ago you'd spoken to somebody who is in a contact center, is that sort of first line of defense, and you said to them, what would be helpful? That idea of having something pop up on your screen and say, oh, this is so-and-so, this is what happened last time they called. Oh, I can hear you're talking about this. I'm just going to show you the last few decisions they've made or the most recent issue that they had, not having to read everything in a huge sort of CRM database, but having someone, an AI assistant, sort of highlight relevant pieces to you so that you can act really well. There's really amazing stuff going on as well in terms of the sort of financial vulnerability characteristics. So some amazing uses of AI highlighting on, and again, it is often calls, but increasingly things like email and SMS as well, saying there's a risk that this person is vulnerable. Now that might be because of lack of understanding or some of those sort of more those characteristics, but it's also things like financial abuse, domestic abuse, financial control, which still is, but especially historically has been incredibly difficult to highlight, measure, flag. So to have an AI assistant to be doing all that thinking in the background for you, and again, not intervene, but just raise those flags to the people at the front line is really exciting, and hopefully will go a long way to businesses in the financial services industry being able to cater better to vulnerable customers, whatever that looks like. And then there is the personalization piece in terms of actual communications. Probably the biggest opportunity in the short term is just being able to deal with huge data sets. That's a lot of work manually to pull out that segmentation piece, that personalization piece, checking data for holes, looking at validating the data you've already got. And the idea of, the last however many years, the conversation about tailoring communication and segmenting what you're sending to people, personalizing how you talk to them, there's always a trade-off between the perfect, end result for a user and a consumer, which is it's all about them and it is 100% personalized, but is incredibly expensive to do it to that level. And also a bit risky because the more versions you have, the harder it is to keep an eye on them all to make sure errors aren't creeping in. And then at the other end, of course, you've got a totally generic communication, which is terrible from a consumer perspective, but is much cheaper than anything else and has the lowest risk of anything because you know exactly what's kind of going out from you to them. So the conversation for a long time has been where on that scale are businesses willing to sit? And that's different for different communications, different products, different initiatives. But with an AI that is able to process huge data sets, that is able not only to flag where personalization is appropriate, but can generate content with these large language models to do the personalization work within all the parameters that the financial services industry is rightly obsessing over, is really exciting because it allows you to get to that extreme of real personalized communication without totally restrictive and ultimately prohibitive costs and kind of risk if you're trying to do it manually. So that's what we're really, really excited about. I suppose there's a completely other side of how AI is getting involved in communication, which is not how the business who's communicating is using AI, but how the consumer who is receiving that communication is using AI. And we've got clients and have had communication, had conversations with people where they say, oh no, we're not ready for AI. It's too risky. We don't feel confident. We're not going to use it, and think that that's going to protect them. Now, to some degree, it will. You're minimizing risk. But if you're sending an email to somebody, the new iPhone, if that's how they're receiving that email, is AI summarizing that communication before they've even opened it. That subject line is no longer what the sender wrote. It's a summary of the email. And when you are sending big packs of information or something that somebody doesn't understand, the first thing they're going to do is stick it into ChatGPT. And then they're going to go off the back of what ChatGPT says. And although there are some parameters, ChatGPT doesn't seem to have the same reservations about the line between guidance and advice. And while that might not be something that the provider ultimately is sort of liable for, it's so important to think about how whatever you send is landing and how someone might be using AI to understand it and to make decisions off the back of it. It's still early days, but that is both a bit scary because of how out of your control it is, but ultimately for people being able to engage with these complex subjects and industries, it could be a really great thing for people to feel equipped to engage with some of the financial services and products that they have.
It must be quite scary for senior leaders embarking on these kind of projects, knowing that and being told that, because, if I envision all my customers are going to be using ChatGPT to interpret my emails in 5 years' time, undertaking something like this, say a personalization program, I would be thinking, well, what's the longevity of this? What's the lifetime in terms of that ROI? I wonder if you can just to summarize, because I know you've got to go, just paint a picture of the journey from establishing a problem, setting a metric, maybe for an example program that you'd roll out, and then when you would measure the ROI. Would it be in 6 months? What would you be measuring? Would you be measuring something initially that would tell you something about a lagging metric that you'd take later on?
Yeah, so I suppose at the beginning, it's that conversation about really what you're trying to do, because actually sometimes personalization won't be the problem at all. So digging under the bonnet and saying, really, what are we trying to do here? There are occasions where you say, actually, it's just a process problem. the communication is a tiny piece of the puzzle. But let's say for this example that the communication is a huge part of it. So it might be something like an onboarding pack. Someone signed up for a product or a service, which is great. And you need to equip them to be able to navigate it. A lot of our clients is long-term financial products. And for the first time, the regulation is saying it's not just about it being suitable for someone when they buy it. It's incumbent upon the provider to make sure that product is still suitable for the sort of lifespan of the way that you're engaging. So with something like that, it is so important then to do that journey mapping, to say, yes, there's the sales piece. And often that is where the budget goes, because that's the kind of commercial imperative for lots of these organizations, which is totally understandable. But in that sales piece, saying, okay, well, how do we now invest in the communication that stays with our consumer as we go forward? When we send the first communication about the product after they've been onboarded, and in that onboarding process, or when something changes, when interest rates are changing, when inflation goes up, does the messaging we're sending then have the same level of rigor and of kind of quality as we put into all those sales and marketing communications at the beginning? Can we test that? Particularly when it feels like bad news. And I have to say, more often than not with financial communication, any change is perceived as bad news. So we're talking about inflation. Inflation's gone up, but as a result, actually, your interest payments are going to go up. This is great news, but as soon as somebody sees a subject line that's talking about inflation going up, everyone thinks that's a terrible thing. So can you test it? Can you figure out how to frame that information, what context you need to give? Do your consumers really understand inflation and interest? Don't assume that that's the case. How can you explain it? Not in a patronizing way, but just being really clear. Test those communications, see what happens. And then you're figuring out your metrics as well. So in sending that communication, what are you actually looking to do? For some people, it will be, honestly, we just want people to click on it because we are not yet confident that anyone's reading anything. And for others, it will be, actually, there's a real risk that when something like this changes, that people switch, that people decide they don't want to have this anymore. And they don't appreciate sometimes, particularly with long-term financial products, the downsides of getting out too early. So again, how do we frame that? Looking at that journey piece, should we have said something in the onboarding letter? Probably. Should we have had something in an online email journey when they first got into the kind of product? Yes, we probably should have. Okay, well, that's something we can now feed back into the new consumers coming through. And for what we've got now, how can we move those dials? With something like engagement, where you're trying to measure, for example, understanding, which again, with something like an interest or an inflation piece, there's nothing for a consumer to do. But you want to, as the business, have confidence that they've understood what you've told them. So testing is really valuable there as a proxy. How can you be as confident as possible that this message lands well? But also, are there other adjacent measures that you could use? Do you have that layering so that someone can click and find out a bit more, that someone could speak to someone if they wanted to? Do you have a series of more nuanced information that people can go into? All of those things, how many people click through for that more information, and then what happens next will tell you how they're engaging with it. It's not going to tell you on a scale of 1 to 10 how well was it understood, because that's too difficult a measure. But that's not an excuse for not having any metrics and only seeing if anyone opened it. How can you kind of layer those metrics down? And then try it again. Try a bit of A/B testing. The next time something like this happens, maybe you send 2 communications, see how they perform against each other, continue to iterate. That's also something that I think Consumer Duty is pulling up a lot of, which is just because you did it once and it was fine, doesn't mean it's still fine. Keep improving, keep measuring. And once you've got those measures in place and you have mapped your journey, that feedback loop becomes much, much simpler and much more easier to implement in terms of small incremental improvements, rather than treating everything as a standalone piece of communication. That's quite a long potential example, but I think it illustrates there's so many moving parts, and communication is only the bit that the consumer receives. You've got 101 processes operating under the bonnet, and those are also really important. Those will also affect your metrics. So your metrics will always be a bit bigger than just communication, which is why you need to map that journey and make sure everything's feeding in to move the dial together.
That's great. I have to let you go, but before I do, where can we find you and Quietroom?
So our website is probably the best place to come for anything. So quietroom.co.uk, you'll find loads of insights, you'll find webinars and events that we've got going on. We're talking loads about AI at the moment. So if you're interested in that, particularly in how your consumers might be understanding the things that you send them using that, we've got loads of content, a brilliant webinar coming up about that in the next month or so. And yeah, on LinkedIn, I'd love to talk to people if anyone's got questions. If anyone wants to talk about this in more detail, then always happy to have a chat.
Great stuff. Thank you for your time, Chloe Taylor. Speak to you soon.
Thanks, Sam.